Hello and welcome to Kirtan London Journey to Joy podcast. I think this is episode number 14 now, with your hosts for today, myself, Madhva, and I'm joined by a very extra special guest whose name is Acyuta Gopi. Some of you may already know her. She is very well known for her Kirtan, of course. In fact, some of us have, you could say, in a friendly way, nicknamed her the Lioness of Kirtan. So if you haven't heard any of her Kirtans, then please do go check her out. Her name is in the description of the episode. Acyuta is a wonderful soul. I'm going to just embarrass her quickly before we start. She's a really wonderful person, so kind-hearted. I've known her for some years now, and she's always just been really nice and friendly. She was somewhat of the cool girl when I went to New York, where she's based. And you know how the cool people can sometimes be. They can be a little bit too cool for school, but Acyuta was never like that. She was always just very kind, conscious, and aware. So I always appreciate that about her. As well as that, she's quite the scholar. She's written her own book called Prema Mala, which is a book of spiritually, prayerfully infused poems. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Please
Perfectly.
Put your hands together for our special guest, Acyuta, who's going to be covering with us for however long it takes. Hopefully it takes a long time. Chapter 8 of the Bhagavad-gita. So before we start, I'm now going to pass it over to Acyuta, who will kick us off with an invocation prayer. I always explain what it is, so if you are a regular listener, forgive the repetition, but if you don't know what an invocation is, or a prayer that we do at the beginning of some kind of spiritual activity, it's a prayer of gratitude to our teachers, and we're showing gratitude for this beautiful spiritual process which we have been passed down. And we're also asking for their blessings, that we may do something pleasing to the divine or God in that way. So Acyuta, please take us away.
Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shrivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare.
Jai, thank you. Welcome, Acyuta.
Thank you.
Really, it's a pleasure to have you. Hopefully you could see my sincerity. I really am sincere. I'm so grateful that you joined us. Thank you so much.
No, it's actually, it's pouring. It's pouring out across.
Yeah. It's too much. I get it. Calm
no,
down.
it's never too much.
Nice. So we're here together. We're going to be looking at chapter 8 of the Bhagavad-gita. So I guess it was 3 weeks ago now, because we postponed today's episode by a week. So normally it's roughly every 2 weeks. And 3 weeks ago, we wrapped up chapter 7 with Mahatma Prabhu, or Martin Hausner, who I believe you also know. Yeah, that was really, really nice. Really wonderful. So today we're starting chapter 8. So what I'll do, Acyuta, I'd love to ask you and just put it to you to start and say, is there some summary or some introduction to the chapter that you could start with to warm up our listeners on the context of what we will start to try and pick out and unwrap and pull from this chapter?
Yeah. What I really like about Bhagavad-gita in general is if you kind of look at the chapters alone, which we often do, we kind of look at them as like standalone chapters. They kind of seem disjointed. Arjuna has these questions, and you can kind of feel like, where are these questions coming from? He comes up with all of these like really deep philosophical, he has doubts and all these things. And I feel like this one is kind of like, ask me anything. You know, you have those like Instagram boxes where you can let people like, ask me anything. I feel like this is a whole situation where Krishna finally is like, ask me anything. Go ahead. Whatever you want. Let's deal with it right now.
Okay.
And I feel like Arjuna gets to really take advantage of that. And he does. But where does it come from? And if we look at the previous chapter, it's like you get the last 3 verses, and we'll kind of talk about that. But we get like the last 3 verses. Krishna has kind of been speaking about a whole bunch of things: worship, demigods, supreme God, all kinds of things, attaining things, where you go, who is intelligent and who is less intelligent, all these different things. But in those last 3 verses, Krishna kind of gives all of these terms. It's like different terms. And if you look at the Sanskrit, those terms spark the questions that come up in the very beginning of chapter 8.
For the last second there, I got slightly distracted. I'll tell you why. We had a nice comment come in on YouTube already. And it is from someone called Manjari for Life. And she was just saying, commenting on your book. You might know her. I don't know if you know Manjari for Life.
I do.
She was saying, yes, wonderful. So she was saying, your book, Prema Mala, takes you on a journey and guides your heart on an adventure towards the divine, or Govinda. For those of you, Govinda is a name for the divine. If you don't have it yet, you're in for a treat. Thank you, Manjari.
Thank you so much. Yeah, she's one of those people who's like the biggest supporter I've ever met.
One of those people with a big heart, so much love.
So huge. And we kind of met because of online lectures and classes and COVID. So if you feel like this COVID thing is like changing your life, like it really can. It can actually create a shift that creates new spirituality and new growth and new friendships and new connections. So yeah, this has been one of the blessings of online pandemic talks and relationships and connecting.
I feel like it connected us more than in the past as well, because this isn't the first live we've done online. We did a few last year on Kirtan London's Instagram pages, which were really fun as well. I think we were talking about the power of prayer.
We're talking about power of prayer and Ramayan. We did a whole, like, that was fun.
The Ramayan, yeah, we did a few things, yeah. Nice. Okay, so back to chapter 8.
Yeah.
So you were saying how he's left off chapter 7. Krishna finishes by talking about lots of cool stuff. And then we're picking up in chapter 8. And Arjuna has been, it feels like a moment of an AMA with Krishna, an ask me anything moment. Krishna's just said a lot. And now Arjuna is in a place where he's saying, all right, can you unpack some of this stuff for me? Let's go deeper into some of this stuff. And that's how chapter 8 takes off.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what I love about how cohesive Bhagavad-gita is. You can look at it as standalone chapters, but when you look at it as a whole trajectory, it becomes this treatise on friendship, how to treat a friend, how to interact with the divine as a friend, if that's even possible.
How easy have you found it seeing that flow in the Gita? Because I say this because I was raised studying the Gita at home with my family. And sometimes I struggled because it's somewhat philosophical, obviously, somewhat.
Yeah.
And it's a deeply spiritual, profound book. And if you're not on a certain level, it can be difficult to follow. I have sometimes found keeping up with a clear flow challenging. How has that been for you, seeing that flow? How much have you had to study it like that?
It was incredibly challenging. You know, Bhagavad-gita is always like one of the first books you come in contact with, even
Yeah.
if you've grown up a Krishna kid, you know, like
Yeah.
they start you off with Bhagavad-gita verses when you're 5 and you memorize them in like Sunday school or, you know, all kinds of stuff. But it wasn't until maybe 18, 19, and they were doing different Bhagavad-gita studies at my temple here in Brooklyn. And I started going to those. And even then, it wasn't until someone like just kind of proposed the theory that, hey, look, Arjuna's questions are not just like out of the blue. Because before that, to me, they really did seem like, how did you, from whatever he said, come up with this question? Like I was just like, you know, Arjuna, you're really a genius because I'm lost. But it wasn't until, you know, there was a teacher who was saying, he said, you know, Arjuna's questions don't come out of nowhere.
Right.
And they kind of proposed that theory that they actually spin off of something that Krishna said. And so I kind of used that, and I was like, well, a good analogy should be able to run throughout. And so I kept looking for this theory, you know, this hypothesis, like if bhakti is a scientific process of spirituality, let's see if the theory works. And it really, really does. And I don't think I would be able to have found that even still had we not have the specific translation that we have right now. Srila Prabhupada's translation gives a word for word transliteration, which is usually not found. Like, you know, you can have the Sanskrit, you can have the English, but the word for word breakdown doesn't always come into play. So without that, it would have been, it would have been so much more difficult for me to go back and see, hey, wait, this is the same word. Like he's asking about this specifically because Krishna used that word at the end of the last chapter. And so he's literally asking about terms. So Krishna throws out all these terms like, okay, but what does that even mean? Like, what does that mean for me? What does that mean in my life? And I find that I'm always asking that about spiritual literature. It's like, okay, take away all the fancy terminology and all the fancy words. What does this mean for me? And I honestly, without Srila Prabhupada's translation and that transliteration, that like minute detail, which I used to take for granted, now has become the thing where I'm like, wow, I really try to take a look at what each of these words mean.
The word for word, man. If you ever do study the Gita, if this inspires you for somehow or other to look at the Gita, there's a few simple words you can learn pretty quick in Sanskrit, I found. There's a few words you're just making me think, Eva, certainly.
Yeah.
There's a few small filler words that are used regularly throughout the Gita. And because you have this, like Acyuta saying, you get this word for word transliteration for every verse. There's a few words that in Sanskrit you can start to pick up, which is pretty cool. I mean, I'm talking about something much more mundane. What Acyuta was referring to is that you can actually fully analyze the Gita and go into so much more depth and get so much more out of it because of that as well. But
well, actually, in my notes for this, I actually put down the point. I was like, you know, you could become a little bit of like a Sanskrit scholar just using these books. Yeah, just using these books, you know, like you get a whole array of vocabulary.
I'm not that scholarly, so I haven't developed that skill, but friends of mine, probably yourself included in this by the sound of it. My parents know so much Sanskrit. So many of our parents, we're Krishna kids, right? We grew up with this culture of bhakti yoga, kirtan from our birth. So our parents were doing this for a long time already. And So many of my friends and elders know so much Sanskrit simply by studying the books. They've never studied Sanskrit, but they've become very scholarly in that respect. Sanskrit's an epic language, by the way.
Isn't it? It's so cool. And
It's the oldest language in this. When you start to look at, what's the word? The word for the study of language.
Linguistics.
Then you can make associations back to Sanskrit as well. That's pretty cool. Sometimes you can see words that have their roots in Sanskrit. Anyway, I guess this is interesting to Krishna kids. I don't know who else this would be actually interesting to.
Actually, I mean, I think it's interesting to everybody. I mean, as like, it's funny that you were saying that I was one of the cool kids, but never really acted like it. And I was like, that's because I wasn't a cool kid. No,
that's because I was a weirdo.
That's it. Everywhere else, like this weird nerd, but inside. Yeah. So for me, like, my inner research nerd's like, but it's so cool, the etymological differences and similarities and looking at all these linguistic things and how they work together, and then meanings of words that we don't have in English. Like they were talking about a word in Sanskrit, which is it's not just happiness or not just bliss, but it's that happiness from seeing someone else happy. And they have like a word in German, which is like the opposite, that happiness from seeing somebody else upset.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I was just kind of like, it's so interesting that it's like just one word, but it's a feeling, it's a mood in English that it encapsulates just one word in Sanskrit.
Yeah. And I was also thinking about this, and I was thinking that sometimes when you read the Gita, there appear to be heavy statements or words which to me feel somewhat heavy. I don't want to use the word aggressive, but for example, demon. It's like, yo, what the hell? Right? It's talking about demoniac things. And in our Western culture, the way that word has evolved leads us to think of goblins and ghouls and scary nighttime creatures and so on and so forth. But it doesn't always translate like that in Sanskrit. That's not how it's always being used to create this fearful monster vibe. It's used to describe a mentality sometimes. It's used to describe, it just has a different connotation. The word in Sanskrit is asura. And what does that word actually mean? Do you remember? It's something to do with someone
so like it's like suras are those who are godly or who decide to follow Lord Vishnu, and asura is the opposite. Yeah.
Exactly. Someone who's ungodly, who does things which are ungodly, right? So those are demons. It's the English word, but it doesn't fully.
No. Yeah. There's such a thing of like context and connotation, like if you have a context of Vedic spirituality, Asuras was a race.
Right.
It's legit a race of people born, bred, and sometimes they stay with the mentality, sometimes they break out of the mentality, they don't but they were actually a race of people. So now when we hear demon, we think you're like, oh well, they've gone and worshiped Satan and done all this stuff, but here in a Vedic context, it's like completely different. And I kind of realized that we have that even now. I was just in London, and even a word. So like between New York and London, we speak English, but it's a different English. Like it's a different language.
True. So true.
So like the word scheme. Like the word scheme in London, it was kind of just like used like, here, this is the telephone scheme or whatever. It's like, it just means like your telephone plan or something. Here, if you say a scheme, you're about to be swindled out of all of your money.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So the word scheme has such a different like mental connotation for us New Yorkers. So I turned to my sister at one point and I was like, they keep using this word scheme and I don't want to buy anything. And finally, we just had to realize that same word, just totally different. And I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind when we study these books, especially when it comes to even the commentaries. There's so many commentaries where, like you said, they can feel like some really heavy statements, but we have to understand that, wait a second, these commentaries were realized by somebody over 50 years ago who was of a certain age, who came from a completely different background, where now this English was not just British English, but British by way of Bengal, India English.
Yeah, and it was actually somewhat Scottish English as well.
Yeah. So
back then, Bengal, India.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different language in some cases.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important to note when really trying to give respect and really studying these Vedic literatures, and keeping in mind that ultimately, what was the goal, right? What was the point of all of this?
Yeah.
Was to say hey, wait a second, everybody is on this journey to joy. Let me help. Let me tell you what I found.
I was reflecting on this today because it's funny, I don't often call myself a Krishna kid, but in the context of this podcast, without people, this podcast is really, the goal of this is to try to share the wisdom from the Gita for those who are potentially newer to a spiritual practice, searching. And so I have my own in-house names, terms, and phrases that I've always used just because I was raised in this Krishna conscious culture. So for example, I'm more used to calling myself either a Gurukuli, which is some kind of Sanskrit spin-off word that's developed, or second generation, because anyway, it's another story. So I'm not used to calling myself a Krishna kid, but whatever. As a Krishna kid, okay, wait, where was I going with that now? Now that I digress to share that. Right. We never met the author of this book.
Yeah.
Srila Prabhupada, the book that we're studying. And when you're raised in a spiritual tradition, you might want to say a religious environment as well. And our parents and our parents' generation, I say that for yourself and myself, Acyuta, they were around, or at least were around very close to the time before Srila Prabhupada left the planet. And so they had a very much personal connection in some way with Srila Prabhupada, and a personal appreciation, a deep appreciation. You'll hear so many of that generation of people who are now in their 50s and above, or 60s and above rather, sharing how Prabhupada saved their life. Prabhupada saved their life, right? With this spiritual knowledge, the journey that he made across the ocean from India to America to share this, saved their life. And I felt many times in my life that I lacked that level of appreciation. And it was actually today that I was listening to another spiritual discussion that I'm a part of. It's another group that I'm a part of where we discuss one of these books similar to the Gita. It's called the Bhagavad-gita. And I was appreciating that same feeling. I was actually feeling like, wow, Prabhupada saved my life, man. Like for real. Yeah. This is real stuff.
Yeah.
And it was just a moment of genuine appreciation that what Prabhupada did, these books that he gave, they just gave me the most valuable gift that life has to offer. Saved my life. So how did we get to this point, by the way?
we were talking about the fact that we have a transliteration and that we can go word for word, and because we need it, otherwise, how would we know what Arjuna is asking and why?
Okay, thank you, Acyuta, for being so level-headed and knowing where we are. I'm supposed to be hosting this freaking thing. Here's me all lost. Achuta's keeping us on
we're
track.
Together. We're here together on this, okay?
Yeah. Okay. So that was a digression, but that was a really nice introduction.
I totally agree with everything that you said. And I think that it's really imperative not to just look at Bhagavad-gita, but to look at the person who spent so much time recompiling such an extensive one. I've seen a lot of Bhagavad-gitas through college, through whatever, and none of them are this big. None of them are this thick. You've got verse, you've got translation. Sometimes you don't even have the verse. You've just got poetic translation. And here, somebody took the time to break it down, literally like it was a science report. You see a science report and you've got all these steps and hypothesis and written, and it's so intricate. And you think, when you have to do that science report, you're like, this is so tedious. I don't feel like doing this anymore. But somebody did it. This man was in his 60s and he did it. And I was just recently reading and reminding myself that the first eyewitness accounts, the first-hand accounts, were saying that he would type on his typewriter, and there were some that would ask him, oh, can I help you? Like, Swamiji, do you need help? And he would say, if you can, no problem. But they would also have to work. And he was in India still, little, with his typewriter, and he didn't know how to type. And he typed it with one finger.
Really?
One finger.
Oh my God.
Right?
Wow. That's dedication right there.
To be that dedicated to say, no, this is my work. This is my goal. This is what I'm giving my life to. This is my mission.
Yeah.
And no matter how long it takes, no matter how successful I am, I'm going to have faith that it's going to work because my teacher told me so.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put my all into it. Like I have such a hard time doing that with myself. Just, having faith in me enough to say, I'm going to throw it all into what I think is possible, what I believe in.
I feel like I'm feeling a need here to caveat to the audience, because I'm aware that this discussion tends to happen a lot on this podcast with the different speakers that have come on. Well, it started off with myself and another friend, Chintamani, who started as the co-host for the first 6 chapters. We went through 6 chapters together. And then due to other responsibilities in her life, she had to drop out. And so then it was Mahatma who came in for chapter 7. And now you're our 3rd co-host coming in to support with chapter 8. And with Chintamani, this sidebar conversation happened multiple times. With Mahatma, this conversation happened multiple times. And now with you, it's the first thing that's happening. And so I just want to say that we're not planning this. It's not that we're here behind the scenes cohorting and saying, right, we have to promote Srila Prabhupada and say all these cool things about him so that people will want to read his books. And it's just, it happens very naturally because there is genuine appreciation for what we've received. And yeah, it's not planned. We're not trying to trick y'all, okay?
Yeah, this is totally genuine. It's like the day you realize how cool your grandfather actually is. Exactly. Like most of the time, like you see the elders in your family, they've kind of been sitting there and, they've been quiet. But then you realize that they have this like awesome story, or they were some amazing like hero in the army or general or something, and that day that you realize how cool your grandparents are, and you're like, wait a second, you had a life before you were just grandpa. I feel like it's been a little bit of that, like Bhagavad-gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, all these books have been there. And then all of a sudden, I think as I grew up and started having responsibilities, coming into my own as an adult, you look around and then you think, wait, you did what? At what age? Like it becomes so real. And then the moment it becomes real, it's almost like impossible. Like how did you, who thinks of doing that?
Yeah.
Like who thinks it like end of their 60s, okay, let's go on a 40-day journey at sea. And like, I don't want to take a flight that's longer than 6 hours. I can't think of traveling anywhere for 40 days.
They actually made a movie about him recently, didn't they? The man, what was it called?
Hare Krishna, the man who started the movement, the man.
Yeah, it was the Hare Krishna movie, the man, the something. I forget the title of it now. Anyway.
Which is so bad because I was like featured at the very end in like a really small clip. I'm like, I should remember the name of the movie. But it was a good movie.
Acyuta's been featured in multiple things like this, documentaries, movies, and she's just epic. She's in Gauravani's albums. She was one of the core singers. If you know who Gauravani is, if you're into Kirtan, you probably know who he is. Acyuta's one of the core singers that sang so much of his on his albums, being highlighted in movies. Got a freaking famous person with us right now, people. Last thing on this that I wanted to share as well, and again, this is something that has been said before, is that as a spiritual seeker, because although I've been raised in Krishna consciousness, I class myself as a spiritual seeker, and I'm going to assume most people listening to this are spiritual seekers. Why the hell otherwise would you be listening to a Bhagavad-gita podcast, somewhat of a study group type vibe? You'd be doing something else with your time if you weren't a spiritual seeker. Yeah. And what we have seen throughout history, time and time again, is people in positions of power being untrustworthy. Whether it's political leaders, spiritual leaders in all spiritual traditions or religions, whether it's family members, whatever it is, there's a real problem with trust. And it's not for no reason, because people have been cheated so many times. They've been hurt, they've been abused, and it can become very difficult to feel safe placing your faith in someone or something because of that. But Prabhupada gave us that. And I say that as a young man who's been raised around spirituality my whole life. I'm no naive newbie to spiritualism. I feel like I can say this sincerely, is I've seen a lot. I've heard a lot. My parents were genuine spiritual seekers. They've shared a lot with me. And I know you'll say the same thing. I feel as though very quickly I have a knack, and I think most people do, not everyone. Yeah. Some people do have a knack to spot bullshit. This is bullshit right now, yo. Sorry, forgive my French. But that's how it is. You can spot rubbish. Mm-hmm. But with Prabhupada, it's the real deal. What he's sharing with us is the real deal. If you're serious about going deep into your spiritual life, and something else that shocks me as well is the depth of what he shared. It's not some shallow spirituality. It's deep as hell, and you can go down the rabbit hole forever, just depending on how far you want to go. Studying, learning, praying, meditating, growing, evolving spiritually, and just feeling those genuine effects in your life. It's not for no reason he came to share this. This is the science of how to become happy. It's an entire science. You said it earlier, that this is, you use that word science, and that's what it is. In fact, the whole Gita starts off with Prabhupada saying, This is a scientific study. How does he word it? Let me just quickly find it. This is the first. The Bhagavad-gita is the widely read theistic science. That's how he terms it. It's a theistic science. So it's incredible that he did so much, and he really was the real deal.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, like you said, like just wrapping it up. But half the time, like we are sitting there trying to figure out a way how to like pull back on the rabbit hole while we try and express what he gave to other people. Like we spend so much time trying to figure out like, okay, how do we get somebody new to understand this thing? Like, well, he came to a country, and if he thought about that, it was like a momentary concern. And then he thought, but look, I don't even know how long I'm going to be here. Better give them as much as I possibly can humanly. And there's some 84 volumes of books. 84.
We just be scratching the surface, y'all.
I know, like with this one book, you know how long it takes us to go through this one book? Yeah. So, but yeah, and I say this with full knowledge that I am a Black American woman. There are going to be terms, like you said, like you come up on terms and you're like, what does that even mean? Like, what is that? How could he say that? I feel like those are the questions that I get most often. It's like new people with, oh, but I heard that he said this in this one section. How is that even possible? Doesn't that sound racist or sexist or so-and-so or ageist to you or to me? And my first question is, how did you get there? How did you get to that point? Because it takes a lot of reading to get there.
Yeah.
Number one, how'd you reach there so quickly? Find that. And number two,
it takes a lot of reading to get there.
Yeah, like that. Some people are like, what about fourth canto? I'm like, but how did you get to the fourth? That means there were 3 other cantos you had to read through, and a canto is not a small thing for those of us who don't realize. So Srimad Bhagavatam, in English they call them cantos. In Sanskrit they're called khandas, right? So they've got these like volumes. For Srimad Bhagavatam there are 12 of them. But when Srila Prabhupada translated it, he didn't just keep one book, one canto. In some versions, the first canto alone is 3 books. You've got a second
somewhat big books as well.
Yeah, and they're like 400-page books, like they're yeah. So for me, I'm like, okay, you had to go through 4, 8, 1,200 pages of first canto, and then you're telling me that you somehow wound up in canto 4. So that, first my question is, how'd you reach there? But my second thing is, like you said, everybody has a BS meter. Mine is really, really good. And what I know is that man was not racist. That man, I fully endorse this man. I will figure, I think, and I've given this answer, like people have come to me with some like controversial statements or statements that they feel are controversial. Mm-hmm, they're like, well, what do you think about that? And they kind of like wait for the answer, wide eyes. And for me, I'm like, but look at what he did. What did he do? Like, there's this one sentence that you found that's giving you a problem, but what did he do? There was a famous Bhakti Tirtha Swami, famously, was Black Swami, and Srila Prabhupada had no problem giving him initiation, giving him this Brahminical culture, which was like higher echelons of spirituality for Indian people. You don't just give that to anybody. You don't even give it to Westerners. Like, straight out disqualified right there. If you're not from the subcontinent, that's it. But he had no problem giving it to this one, a guy from Cleveland. So he had no problem at all. But not only that, whenever he would hear of the preaching work that Bhakti Tirtha Swami was doing, they would say he would cry. He would cry in happiness. And he would ask his other disciples, he's like, he's preaching in what was then communist Russia, hiding in bathrooms in order to be able to preach and meditate. He's like, what's the problem? His famous line, what's the difficulty?
Right.
Like, what's your issue here? You don't have any of those restrictions. So the amount of pride, the amount of happiness, I feel like if you take a look at his body of work, his life, it then speaks for itself about his character. He had no problem telling women, no, go give class now. You're speaking today.
Yeah.
So right. I feel like it kind of, if we, like you said, with context and connotation, if we're able to couch those problematic doubts that we might have, which that's a lead into this 8th chapter. If we're able to couch those problematic doubts that we have and kind of wrap them up in faith about like who this person is, what their goal is and what they're talking about, and my relationship with this person, I feel like it makes such a big difference.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Right. Okay. The thing is, we can't help ourselves, can we? Yeah. When we start talking about Prabhupada. So let's come back to his writings. Chapter 8. The first verse of chapter 8. Arjuna is asking Krishna a question. Right?
Yeah.
I'll just read it. Let me just start by reading the verse.
You have to.
We spent 43 minutes talking about Prabhupada. I love that. Okay. Okay, so chapter 1, text 1 of chapter 8. Another word that you learn very quickly because it's in so many of the verses. Uvacha. Which is said. So for example, here it starts off, Arjuna Uvacha. Arjuna said, O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman? What is the self? What are fruitive activities? What is this material manifestation? And what are the demigods? Please explain this to me. So should we start by just talking a little bit about this?
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, it's like, where did these questions come from? Like, how did you, Arjuna, what happened? How'd you get here?
Yeah.
And what I love, it's not from nowhere. So if we look at the word for word.
Yeah.
I pull up 2 screens simultaneously. So we have this, what is Brahman? What is Adhyatman, the self? And we've got all of these things. Okay, but like why? So even if you look at, O Supreme Person, but if you look at chapter 7, Krishna says, it's like in the middle. He's like, as the Supreme Person, as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, I can give everybody intelligence. I can help. I know everything that's already happened. So even just that phrase, it's not unsolicited. It's not just like, so he's like, okay, you've just now, not only did you declare it before, like, okay, but Krishna's like making and remaking this point because they were friends, cousins and friends. And they had such a close friendship that they'd sit with each other, they'd visit each other, they'd sit on the same seat, they'd like have sleepovers, like all kinds of things. Okay. It's like, you fall asleep talking to your friend, but you kind of fall asleep on them. And this is Krishna and Arjuna.
Right.
And so Krishna has to like make and remake this point, like, okay, we're talking, and I know you're used to taking advice from me, but now we kind of got to also remember that I'm also the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by the way.
Just throwing that in there.
Just side note, by the by, I happen to be. Yeah, and if we look at the word for words, even from the last chapters, like those last 3 verses, Krishna's talking about persons who have acted piously in previous lives and in this life and do sinful actions and all this stuff. But he mentions about people. He starts talking about the real nature of who they are, and he uses that adhyatma. So a lot of these terms that Arjuna's asking about, Krishna's mentioned. So then he's kind of like, okay, now, but what's this deal? Like, what's the deal with all of this? Like, what's happening? And in the very next verse, I love how it leads in, which is, we have purports, which is really fancy word for commentary, but which is another word that's like so intrinsic to this Krishna consciousness culture, like a purport.
Yeah.
You don't really, I remember feeling really smart in college because you had all of these like cool words that really just came from these books that I had grown up in and around. And so you hear these things thrown around, you're like purport. And I remember like using the word purport, but in an essay, like, well, purported here. And you sound really philosophical, but really it's just Prabhupada.
Yeah. I sometimes get confused.
Sound really good.
I sometimes get confused on which words are actually English words, or is this some kind of in-house word, or is it a Sanskrit word? Because they're words that just are not common outside of the spiritual culture that we were raised in.
Words and phrases. Yeah, I've tried to figure that out. Like some of them, I'm like, is this a real thing, or is this a Prabhupadism?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, just on sidebar again, Hare Krishna to Paulo Barroca from Brazil. He said that a little while ago on the YouTube comments. We've got Dina Dwarka Leela Devidasi. Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj. Jai, by the way, Jai is something which is a Sanskrit word which we use to praise, or say somewhat of an English translation could be all glories type thing, or like that, right?
Yeah. So, and it's so funny. It does have like several meanings. You've got like victory, you've got like
victory,
glory, you've got like all these things. But really, in like a in church speak, it really is like praise him.
Right. Praise too. Yeah. So she's saying Jai Srila Prabhupada, Jai Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj, another the black Swami that you referenced. Yeah. And Jai beautiful devotees. Maybe that means us. Maybe that means all the beautiful devotees. Thank you, Dina Dwarka Leela Devidasi. And Carmela Naidu just commented and said, this is awesome, with a love heart smiley face. So thank you, Carmela. Appreciate you too. So you were saying how he's tying this in.
Yeah.
Arjuna's questions are not random. He's tying it into things that Krishna has already said.
Mm-hmm.
And then you said just in the next verse, then we sidebar, we were talking about Sanskrit and how intelligent you looked when you were studying. But then were you starting to bring in text too? Were you referencing that? Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, of course we should read it. Who is the Lord of sacrifice? And how does he live in the body, O Madhusudan? And how can those engaged in devotional service know you at the time of death? So, of course, once again, we're looking at all of these questions, and it's like, I get it, because in the English, it was like, yeah, no problem. He's speaking about those who worship the demigods, and then they can go there. But then those who worship me, then they come to me, and then that's fine. And it all works out. But it's like the Lord of sacrifice and like, how did we get there? But once again, I had to really go back and look at the word for word. And I was like, oh, look at that. There it is. So it's in the previous chapter. And we get a chance to kind of just see a little bit his thought process. But besides his thought process, what I really like is in the purport where Srila Prabhupada speaks about Arjuna addressing the Lord as Madhusudan. Because Krishna once killed a demon, there goes that terminology again, named Madhu. Actually, these questions, which are of the nature of doubts, should not have arisen in the mind of Arjuna, because Arjuna is a Krishna conscious devotee. Therefore, these doubts are like demons. Since Krishna is so expert in killing demons, Arjuna here addresses him as Madhusudan, so that Krishna might kill the demonic doubts that arise in Arjuna's mind. And, cool paragraph. But like you said, you're like, okay, what is that? How does that, what just happened? Are there little goblins running through my mind?
Yeah. And that wasn't that word. When I brought that up earlier, I wasn't even thinking about this. I literally just used the word demon because it seems like an obvious one. And here we go. Here's a great example of it.
Yeah. So, you can wind up thinking like, what does that mean? But if we look at the insidious nature of doubts, you get a doubt, and sometimes it really can become this thing which it can overshadow everything good. It can completely take over and turn you into a different person. It can create a shattered view of everything that you've ever had. So yeah, if we look at terms of like, even if we think about demons as little goblins, I started later on, there's another chapter that divine and demonic consciousness and activities. And I remember changing my perspective of that, just thinking of, okay, if I really did think about it as this little green monster that comes up every time and says, no, you can't. Like I'd really start looking at it differently. Like, wait a second, what if that's not actually me? What if that's not the truth of who I am? Every time that little voice comes in and goes, no, you can't. No, you shouldn't. Like, oh, I think I'm really trying to be a spiritual seeker. No, you're not. Like, if I thought about it as a separate entity, one that could be conquered, little goblin, that all I needed to do was ask for help from this supreme best friend first, supreme person second. If that's all I needed, like how much more often would I be calling out for help? Really understanding that, wait a second, that's actually all it takes, is an acknowledgement of, I think I need something bigger than me to conquer this little goblin. And then, those doubts, when I started looking at them like that, they become less like huge obstacles that I couldn't overcome and more like funny annoyances. Like, you ever see those Mucinex commercials? There's a medicine we have here. It's called Mucinex, and it's like to clear out all the phlegm in your chest, and like if you get a cold. But what they have is they've kind of like characterized the mucus as this little green blob that like goes around really angrily, like disrupting your day.
Yeah, I've seen similar things, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So every time I started thinking about it, and I was like, okay, what if like the self-doubt and the all of these demoniac natures, these little things that we actually can see within ourselves, I started characterizing them like little green, like mucus glob. And it became less of something that I was like, okay, it became less of like, oh, I'll never get over this, and more of like, you're ridiculous looking. And finally it became more like, I don't have to listen to you. You're
Wow.
made of phlegm. Like, and so it really helped getting over the doubts, to really characterize them as something separate from me, separate from my actual identity. So I really like that.
So I have a question for you on that, which is, when you're saying doubts, what exactly do you mean by that? So do you mean as in when you doubt yourself, when you doubt your own desire to go deeper in spirituality? What kind of doubts are you specifically referring to?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because, all these things get in your notes, and then your notes get like thrown out the window halfway through.
Thank you so much for having notes, Acyuta. Look at you coming into this podcast so well prepared.
No, I
Such
like
a legend.
But it kind of leads into what this Bhagavad-gita is all about. I love that it's a spiritual tradition where you are encouraged to ask questions. Like, have questions, have experiences. If you have something that's holding you back, yeah, that's going to be natural. Like they always say, Arjuna is this example. Srila Prabhupada said he shouldn't have had these questions, these doubts, because he was a Krishna conscious devotee. Okay, so then why? So then they always say it's for our benefit. But what does that really mean? Okay, Arjuna's going to have a breakdown. So yeah, can we relate? Absolutely. And then Arjuna's going to have this crisis of even faith. So Krishna's telling him something and he's like, I hear the words. I have no idea what that means. Like, I like this chapter because in essence, I feel like Arjuna's like, I have no idea what you just said. Bro, I'm going to need you to break that down in warrior talk because right now it went completely over my head.
Right.
And I love it because Krishna is just so patient. He's like, okay, let's talk about it. You know, they're in the middle of a battlefield on a chariot.
Right.
Krishna's like, no problem. Let's talk about it. Let me try and clear it for you. So I love that we're encouraged to have doubts. So does doubts just mean our own internal struggles, like things that I can do on a day-to-day basis? Sure. But can it also mean like a crisis of faith? Like I've been in this spiritual path and now I feel like, what? Do I even understand this? Like, what are they saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we're encouraged to have those questions. Dive in. Let's see, what's happening. Let's actually take apart what we've been doing with our lives rather than just going through the motions. I think Krishna consciousness, the heart of it is let's dissect everything. Like they have
Absolutely.
rules and regulations and all these things, but never just because I said so.
It's not about, I love thank you for the clarification. It's what you're saying. What I'm hearing you say is we ain't telling people to go out there and have blind faith.
Yeah, no.
And neither is anyone on this path encouraged to believe things blindly. Questions and doubts in that sense, when it's just a genuine, okay, I don't get this, or this doesn't yet make sense to me based on my life, my experiences, my lens, etc. Can you explain it to me?
Yeah.
We're encouraged to do that. Ask
Yeah.
questions. Go deeper. That's how you grow. That's how you learn. That's how you realize things, actually learn things deeply. And if you want to go down a spiritual path, you have to have that. You have to maintain your intelligence. Whilst at the same time, I guess there's some level of, because sometimes Prabhupada uses the word submissive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So but that doesn't mean dogmatically. It doesn't mean.
You know what it means? Like, what I love is Arjuna can ask these questions now because he's already said in chapter 2, he's like, look, I'm at my wit's end.
Yeah.
And now I'm a soul surrendered unto you. Asking a question in a mood of surrender is different from asking the question that you think you already know the answer
Prove
to.
someone wrong.
Yeah. Like there's a combative attitude. Like you ever have a conversation with someone and instead of actually hearing you, they've already got their answer that they're planning and their way to win this argument.
Yeah.
And
There's
then
no point.
It feels draining. It's like, you're not going to hear me. So here, every question that Arjuna is asking, he's already set the preface in chapter 2. He's like, look, okay, I get it that I now know nothing.
Yeah.
And you're telling me that you know everything. So I'm going to understand that part, that you know everything. I'm going to take that on faith. But now we're also going to test that theory. Let's try it out. Let's see. And I love that he's encouraged, never put down for it. Never like, it's in the very beginning, Krishna's like, how'd this happen to you? Like, how have these impurities come upon you? Like, what happened to you?
Bro,
Bro,
I
what's
thought you
going
were
on?
smarter than that. Like, what the hell?
And really it's kind of like, it's like, but we're cousins, like we're warriors, like this is not what you're crying, what happened? Like you were just fine, what's happening?
Like, bro, you crying?
And not even in a way that like warriors don't cry, but 5 seconds ago you were okay, like drive the chariot in the middle, and then 10 seconds later complete breakdown. It's like, drive my chariot into the midst of both armies. It's like, okay, what are we gonna do, see everybody we already knew was here? Okay, so he drives him in the middle, and then he's like, oh no, I can't do this. He's, whoa, wait a
You
second.
knew those guys were there.
I'm saying we had a whole, like we had a pre-war conference. I went as an ambassador, like we did a thing, like this wasn't just like, RSVP and then they all showed up and we didn't read the list. And some people are here that we weren't expecting. We expected them all. we heard things. We heard conch shells. We like everything was going.
Yeah.
So it's not like, he never shames him about it.
Yeah.
I love that Krishna is so loving.
Yes.
And what he does is, Krishna, the more I read Bhagavad-gita, the more awesome I realize it is. And in reading, sometimes you can get bogged down with the commentaries. So sometimes it's really cool to just read through the translations and really kind of like try and soak it in. What I love that Krishna does is he uses a teaching tactic where he puts out all of these advanced terms first. And then just when you think you're at a point where you're like, not only can I not understand any of this, but I can't even do any of this.
Yeah.
Always at the very last bit, like just when you think you're like, I'm going to have a complete mental breakdown just listening to you explain this. Then he goes, or you could make it really, really simple and just be my friend.
That's it. That's it. That's what I love about Krishna consciousness. Actually, it's so freaking simple. And when you go through this, it can get a little confusing, like exactly like you just said. And sometimes I'm reading it and I'm thinking, hold on a minute, I thought this was really simple. What the hell? Why am I so confused? Why am I struggling to? And then he'll make a comment, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I thought it was too. Yeah, the simple
exactly
part.
that, but that's his point. Like the point is, he's like telling Arjuna, he's like, look, we've been friends for a long time. I'm going to tell you what other people have to do to get to the same point that you're in right now. And he's like, well, Arjuna, you said you wanted to go to the forest and be a yogi. Here, let's do this. You could do this. I mean, they do this and they do this. And he's like, what? He's like, or we could just be friends. And, as we see, like, finally, Arjuna's like, you know what? I think we should just be friends. I don't know about you, but.
Oh, that was a weird laugh. I just laughed. I heard my own laugh there for a second. I'm like, that sounded weird.
No, the most genuine laughs are the weird ones. Like, don't listen to yourself laugh. Don't do it.
It was genuine. It was genuine.
And so is Arjuna. Like, I feel like everything about him is so genuine. And these are all for our benefit, which means, like you said, we're not telling anybody to have blind faith. Neither is Krishna. But he is saying, he's like, but life could be a lot harder.
Yeah.
Just look at how difficult it is to explain it.
Oh, Krishna. This is what on what feels like a connected point to this is what gives me faith in Krishna consciousness. Is that it's not the simplicity of it, because it's simple. It's also very complicated. It's also deeply profound. It's also, it's challenging. But at the same time, it's super essentially simple. But more than that, what gives me faith is this other point that you've been talking about. Or you can just be my friend. Krishna consciousness, bhakti yoga, another name, another pronoun for this spiritual path. Vaishnavism, another pronoun, that these are all the same thing, is essentially about learning to love, not respect, not have awe and reverence for, but to love God. That's what it's trying to teach us. That's what it's trying to say. Hey, this is where your greatest gift is. This is the most wonderful thing that you have, is a loving relationship with God. Personal. So many faiths have, to my understanding, and if there's any listeners out there who have a different understanding, feel free to write it in the comments. But I've always understood it like this. Mostly when you look at religion, there's a relationship with God which is somewhat awe and reverence. You bow down. God is great. God is great. And we have that. We have to acknowledge God is great. But Krishna ain't looking for that. He doesn't want our awe and reverence. He wants our love. He wants our genuine affection. He wants us, the people who we hear about, the great saints in this Krishna culture, in this tradition, in this lineage, were the people who they wanted to protect Krishna from the demons because he's their little Krishna. Yeah. And they care for him and they love him. He has all these personal relationships with his friends, with his family, with Srimati, with Radha, his lover, his like that, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the highest thing that we're aiming for. When we think about life, we think about what are the things in this world that actually give us the greatest happiness. So, for example, there's a nice analogy which is often used. High court judge, he goes in to work and he's very much respected. He's the head of the courtroom, and everyone, all of his colleagues and peers, or rather he's the top of the food chain where he works. And so everyone respects him and looks up to him and treats him with a little awe and reverence like that. And it's all well and good, but he gets so much more satisfaction when he goes home and his little grandchild is riding him and hitting him, saying, "Come on, pony, go faster, go faster." Right? Yeah. And that gives him greater happiness than all of that awe and reverence that he gets at work. And God is the same. And that's what we're trying to achieve, is a loving relationship with the divine. And to me, in my little brain, makes sense that if there's the highest spiritual goal that we can achieve, it has to be higher than awe and reverence. It's love. And that's what this path is trying to offer you or us.
And, you know, I feel that my nephew, one of them, works in the court. Like a lot of my family work in the court system.
Right. Yeah.
And he works. Yeah. So he works in the court system, and he's like a court officer, you know, charged with like protecting people, making sure like the criminals don't get out of hand. And I looked at him one day and he did something really goofy. I looked at him and I was just like,
he's a legend, by the way. Freaking love that dude.
One of the most awesome people I know. And I looked at him and I was like, you have to protect people? I was like, they let you carry weapons. and that right there, it gave me the biggest insight to what people think of when they, you know, when the residents of his hometown look at Krishna. They're like, you protect people? I mean, they're going to still run to him whenever they need protection, but really they're like, you carry weapons. You're just the most awesome person. They trust you with
a gun.
I know, right? I'm like, you're just the most awesome person I know. You know, like you're my family member, my friend, my beloved, whatever it is, you know. I've seen you grow up, or I've been with you through so much. We've talked, we've had these in-depth conversations. So yeah, to see that somebody should give him respect and awe and reverence. I look at him like, you're just my nephew. You're not little, you're bigger
Right.
than me, but
Yeah.
I'm just like, and sometimes it blows my mind. And then, like you said, I bring it back and I'm like, oh, this is what they're talking about. Like, this is how it happens.
Yeah, I love that. I love that real life example with Govinda, who is a legend.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that with this Bhagavad-gita, I mean, coming back to asking questions, what do you do with the people that you are so intimately connected with? You really, you talk to them, you have a conversation. And so I feel like that's the basis and the foundation of prayer. All of these questions that Arjuna is asking Krishna, in my mind, these all become prayers. These all become things that I don't just, okay, they're in a book and they stay in this book. For me, I try to like take them with me. So even something as simple as now, Madhusudan is the one who can expertly kill the doubts in the mind. Now I want to keep it with me so that I can remind myself and my best friend, like, hey, I'm having a rough day, but you're Madhusudan. And what I know about Madhusudan from reading different Vedic scriptures is that Madhusudan carries a sword to be able to expertly cut down whatever is needed. I'm like, Madhusudan, you carry a sword. And Bhagavad Gita already says that, we can cut down the doubts with the sword of knowledge. All of these things. Can you help me? Like, I'm having a rough day. I'm going to need some guidance, but I also need that kind of down to earth guidance that you are so good at giving.
Mm.
We don't have a God who now says, look, just follow what I said because I said so. He's willing to stop in whatever situation you find yourself, whether it's in a battlefield, internally, externally, whether it's one time Krishna stopped in the middle of a forest fire to have a conversation with his friends. It doesn't matter where you find yourself. This is a person, supreme person, who's never going to shy away from saying, okay, what's the problem? Tell me anything. Ask me anything.
All right, Madhva, sit down. Come, sit down, Madhva. It's fine.
Yeah. Come.
Talk to me. Talk to me. Yes, I love that. I love that about this. I really do, because I need it. I feel like we could keep going even on this topic as well. So what I'll do here is, it's now 8:15 here in England.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's 3:15.
Yeah.
For you in NYC. So we have somewhat started chapter 8. We've had a look at.
It was a good introductory session. The next one we're like, steam.
Yeah. Oh, trust me, Acyuta, we're good. I've thoroughly enjoyed this time with you. Thoroughly enjoyed talking about everything we've spoken about. So I'm aware that the podcast, we can go longer. I try to generally keep it about this at a max, just because perhaps for listeners it's easier.
Mm-hmm.
So did you have anything else that you wanted to say before we start to wrap up today's session?
I mean, there's like one question in on YouTube, I think.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you got it as well. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. So the question is, has Krishna said anything about procrastination and how to overcome it? Funny thing, this entire Bhagavad Gita is about procrastination. Arjuna gets on a battlefield and he's like, about face, I don't want to do this anymore. And Krishna's kind of like, but we came here with a purpose. We were here Let's find out like what's really going on behind all of this. And I think that is something that we all need to do when we find ourselves procrastinating. First, if we can follow the method, like with Krishna, he's asking Arjuna, he's like, what happened? How did this happen? We should ask ourselves, like, what's really causing this? Am I afraid to succeed? Am I afraid to fail? What's the worst that could happen? What's the best that could happen? We'll never get out of a situation until we feel sufficiently uncomfortable enough. And I feel like this is Arjuna's dilemma. He didn't want a war to begin with. Nobody wanted a war. Pandavas were trying to keep the peace as much as possible, even at their own detriment. And finally, I feel like Krishna so much like I've done everything you wanted me to do. Enough. Like at certain points, he's like telling me, he's like, look, if it makes you feel any better, they're totally fit to be killed. No, but he's trying to motivate him out of this procrastination situation. So Arjuna's got this procrastination to the extreme. And even at a certain point, Krishna is telling him, he's like, give up the lethargy and just go fight. Like, go do the things. And so how can we overcome it? First, we have to acknowledge what's really going on. We have to figure out where this is coming from and have a real honest conversation with ourselves about it. And then, what does Krishna always say? You can ask for guidance. Go ask questions, find a teacher. Even if you feel like you don't have one, this book speaks back. This Bhagavad-gita, I can assure you, I've done it so many times. You can ask a question, open it at random, and then figure out like, okay, what's Krishna trying to say to me here? I kind of love doing that, like really just kind of like asking a question, meditating on something, and then opening the book at random and trying to find out like, does this apply?
Yeah.
And even when you think it doesn't apply, I bet you something will happen during the day that makes it apply.
Right. Yeah, I've had a similar experience doing the same thing.
See?
Yeah.
So yeah, even if you think you don't have a teacher yet, you do. This book is filled with personality. Krishna doesn't just speak once. He's always speaking it. He's always giving these examples. So in order to get over the lethargy, talk to your friend. Develop a connection with your friend. Make Bhagavad-gita your friend. And I can guarantee you it'll help.
Wonderful. I love that. It's a difficult thing, procrastination. Sometimes we can really get stuck in a rut. We can feel overwhelmed by it. Sometimes you said something as well, something I related to. In my own experience, I've had times where it's not until, I think this is actually a famous saying as well by one of these philosophers or something like that, but it's not until the pain of not changing becomes painful enough that it outweighs the pain of change that do we make the change, right? Mm-hmm. I've felt that where I'm just being lazy with things that I know are good for me, that I have somewhat a desire to do, but I'm just being lazy because there's other easier things to do, especially in this day and age. There's way too many easy things to do with our time that are distractions. And yeah, it's a challenge. And there's no simple answer to the question, but I love your answer. I love that. Your answer is, in your experience, you've connected a method of overcoming procrastination to your study of the Gita. And your connection, I don't even necessarily want to say study, but it sounded more like your connection with the Gita, with this idea of even just having a personal dilemma or question or something that's going on within yourself, and then just saying, I'm going to just meditate on that, and I'm going to open the Gita and see what Krishna is saying about it, and feeling that to be somewhat of a remedy for this. So very nice. Appreciate that a lot.
And that, that whole feeling of like you said, the pain of staying the same
Yeah.
becomes so unbearable that
Yeah.
then you finally begin to change. And even, spoiler alert, even in the course of this Bhagavad-gita, it's like, first there's a whole breakdown, and Arjuna's like, well, I think I got to change. But then somehow in the course of the conversation, he begins coasting again. Like he's like, no, that's okay. I'm starting to understand this, like, but are you really God? I mean, I know you said it 45,000 times, but what is that? What does that even look like? And it almost seems like he's like, no, I've gotten comfortable again. And then Krishna's like, no problem, I'll help you get uncomfortable. And it's like right after that, Arjuna's like, okay, I'm uncomfortable now. This is really uncomfortable. I don't like this at all. Put it back. And then Krishna's like, see, I told you it was better if we just did it my way. But okay, fine, you need an explanation. But then after that, then Arjuna's really able to like completely make that change. Like there's like one last bit of resistance. And it's like, but I could stay the same, even with all the knowledge you've given me. And then he sees this whole universal form, which is too much. And then it's like, okay, no problem. I'm ready to make the switch. We can do whatever you need to do, just so long as that thing doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Like, sure, whatever you say, no problem. Let's do it. So yeah, it really is. All of these analogies can be used with in tandem with Vedic scripture, which I really, really love. There's pretty much, and I used to teach Sunday school, and I tell my Sunday school girls, me and my sister, we tell our Sunday school girls, like, there is literally nothing that you can run past Krishna, like, hey, so I'm having an issue or a problem or anything. There is nothing that he's never going to say, like, been there, done that. Here you go. Let me help you. There's nothing that he's going to say, ooh, never saw that before. Like it's just not a thing. And so I remember, and we were talking about everything, identity, gender, sexuality, the whole thing. Like there's nothing you're going to run past Krishna and he's going to be like, wow, that's a first. And there's nothing that you're going to run past Vedic literature that doesn't actually have something somewhere in there. And for me, that's really comforting. It makes me feel like I can tell him anything.
Yes, absolutely.
Which helps us feel less alone. Because this life can feel really,
you're making me think sometimes that especially in spiritual circles, on spiritual paths, we can be very caught up with ideals, religious circles, spiritual circles, because there's a lot of idealistic things that are promoted. We're talking about the perfection of life, right? And most of us right now, we're not at that level. And so we see a lot of, this is actually one of the things that we see a lot of in spiritual circles, which becomes somewhat fanaticism, where people are trying to live to ideals that are not real to them. And something that's become more and more apparent to me over the recent years is that, you have to be real about where you're at in your spiritual life. And that means, and something that a spiritual teacher who I have a lot of genuine love and respect for, his name is Satchidananda Swami. I know many of you, even possibly listening, will know who he is. He said this recently to a group of us. He was saying, be yourself with Krishna. Share who you are and what's happening with you, with Krishna. Don't be false. What's the point in presenting this false you to your relationship with the divine? You have to be honest. You have to be real. Share your struggles. Share those things that you're embarrassed about talking to people with. Present it all. Bring it all out. Bring it all forward. Offer it. This is who I am. This is where I'm at. This is where I want to go. But this is what I'm struggling with right now. Please help me, like that. And it becomes a real, genuine dialogue between you and your best friend.
And, like, okay, see now, Bhagavad-gita, why? Right? Because I love Krishna consciousness. You're always encouraged to ask, like, why? What's that mean? Well, why? This authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
I feel, is essential. Like you said, if you are not authentic, it will crush you. I feel like this is a marathon, not a sprint, and it's a
Yeah.
lifelong journey and beyond.
Yeah.
So if you are not authentic, it leads, that inauthenticity brings up the Vaishnav definition of duplicity. And that duplicitous nature becomes a thing which crushes your devotion. Now, like, the question is, like, why, right? Well, famously, of course, Bhagavad Gita, ye yata mam prapadyante tam stateva bhajam yaham, as all surrender unto me, Krishna says, I reciprocate. Fancy.
Mm.
What's that even mean? What it means is, if we're not going to have a real dialogue with Krishna, he's going to meet us where we're at and give the same kind of energy. So if we're inauthentic, he'll be the same. If we are going to kind of want to live a life where it's like, I kind of want to pretend like there's like a higher thing going on, but can we just pretend that doesn't exist? He says, even in the last chapter, he's like, okay, sure. He's so reciprocal. Like, for every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. But here, it's like that, not such like opposite pushback, but like opposite, I'm going to meet you halfway, or even more than halfway. So if we're not going to be authentic with Krishna, he's also going to pretend like the problem doesn't exist, because
Mm.
we're pretending like the problem doesn't exist. And the
Mm.
more that we refuse to see ourselves, the more that we refuse to see him within ourselves. Like, he's like, I'm seated within the heart. He keeps saying this whole thing. I'm seated right there in the heart. I've been in the heart all along. I've never left your heart. I've been seated right there. I'm seated as a super soul in every living entity, from atoms all the way up. I've been seated right there. But if we're not taking the time to be genuine and authentic, even with ourselves, how are we going to see him? It's impossible.
Love it. Thank you, Acyuta. So, something I forgot to say to you, and throwing this out there, we normally finish our podcast episodes with just a short snippet of Kirtan.
Woo!
I don't know if you're prepared or not, because I forgot to say this to you in the prep about how the podcast works. If it's possible, if you're able to, we would love to have a few minutes of Kirtan by yourself, from
Sure.
yourself, if that's cool.
Yeah, why not? Let's do it.
Beautiful. Sweet. Thank you. Right. I'm going to put myself on mute for this so that you don't get any sound coming back with the music.
Which, it's just me clapping.
Yeah, because I forgot to prep you for it, but that's fine.
It's okay. Next time, though,
Yeah. Okay.
it's going down. I'm going to be excited.
Thank you, Acyuta. I'm going to go on mute for it.
Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, 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 Jaya Prabhupada, Haribo, 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 Gora, Haribo, 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 Haribo.
Nitai Gaura Premanande. Hari Haribo. Jai. Jai. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Acyuta. That was, by the way, the Kirtan was beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. So we still have a lot of chapter 8 to discuss.
That's right.
We're going to be back here again pretty soon in that case.
More fun.
Amazing. Again, Acyuta's a busy person. She does a lot. So we're very lucky, very grateful, very fortunate that she's here doing this with us. And let's see, we're going to try and long out this chapter as long as we can. Gara just to keep coming back like that. But seeing as how much we got through in today's episode, I think that's just going to happen naturally anyway. So let's see how we do. The thing about the Gita is you can actually go so deep into it. So let's see how we get on. But there's no rush. We're just here trying to go a little deeper into this wonderful book, pull out what we can from it to improve the quality of our own lives. If you've enjoyed today, please share this with your friends. You can ask questions. We had one question today in the comment section. That was very nice. Thank you, Hemant, for that. Just quickly acknowledge a few more people in the comment section. We have Ashwani Diman, Narayan Biswas, Rakesh Soni, and 705 Manoj. And of course, Acyuta, thank you so much. I'm going to stop the live stream here, but we will see you in roughly... Well, actually, we will keep you posted as to when the next episode will be, because this one was a week late. So let's see. I'm not sure when the next episode will be, but I'll speak with Acyuta and we'll figure that out and we'll get back to you all. Thank you so much. Sorry?
I think like last thing, I mean, it's not really a spoiler. They know we're going through chapter 8. So in the time between now and the next time, like, everybody, if you're going through chapter 8 and you're looking at it and you've got a question, like, bring it to the party. Let's see what we can figure out together.
Yes, thank you. Exactly that. This is a podcast, but really think of it as somewhat, I would love it. We would love it for you to get more involved. You can be more involved. People can be as involved in this podcast as they want. It's somewhat of a reading group / podcast, which means we can do it together is the idea. So feel free, if you are going to go through it with us, if you're going to think, okay, great, let's go through chapter 8. Like she said, come with your questions. You can send them in advance. We can come to you with them. We can talk it through on the episode, things like that. You can join us live in the Zoom room. Sometimes we have people who join us live in the Zoom room as well. A couple episodes ago, someone was with us. We had a few people in the room with us, and you can just unmute and ask us questions as well. This is it can be a very interactive thing. So thank you for reminding us of that, Acyuta.